status quo remains. But the president, again, almost leaving room there to say the National Command Council, yet again, will come in and make announcements on the areas of retail that will be eased up and e-commerce that will be eased up even as we remain on level 4. Maybe carefully they're saying, I don't want to make the same mistake that I made 20 days ago where I make an announcement and the Command Council comes in and contradicts me.
Yeah, that's an important tightrope for the president to navigate, particularly when we know that obviously his speeches are not meant to give us the granular details. They're not meant to give us each paragraph of the regulations, but rather the broad overview of what the government's objective is. And I think the mistake that he made weeks ago was to simply go into the terrain of giving us the granular details around the cigarette ban or unbanning, for example. It was not his space to do that. And of course, once the minister in charge of that particular part of the conversation came back and said, well, these are the regulations I'm writing, it then created that fallout, which I think a lot of people simply overplayed and blew out of proportion, because it's still a process of consultation. The president is not preaching the gospel with any speech that he makes. He's simply saying, as it stands today, this is what we think, but if tomorrow data comes back and says this is not the way to go, then of course we're going to change our minds. I think he has learned definitely from that cigarettes fiasco, and I think the way he navigated it today was a reflection of that.
Yeah, apologizing as well tonight on the contradiction and the poorly explained regulations. Today, very clearly, you could see him when he mentioned the word proposal to say, everybody, this is a proposal for end of May to go to level 3 in certain parts of the country. Being a proposal still, I'm sure it will evoke some kind of reaction from critics, political parties, lobbyists and business.
Yeah, of course, and I think it's a matter of how much of the proposal do we think would translate into the actions of government or even the regulations of government. And I think the important thing about a proposal is that he clearly didn't just stand there and imagine string together a few words and say, this is what I think I need to say. But rather, even that proposal itself, as raw as it may be, is on the basis of particular deliberations. So at least we have some insight into what government is thinking about. Now it's going to be a question of, now that we have some form of direction, if some lobby groups, for example, feel strongly for or against a particular proposal, then they'll have the opportunity to make their voices heard, and of course that will inform the final process of regulations. Again, the government's handling of this has been full of highs and a whole lot of lows, because if you look at what Ibrahim Patel issued yesterday, for example, I mean, those regulations being issued to the public without the context of saying this who I've consulted and this how I ended up with this particular list of regulations, they appeared very arbitrary and were quite nonsensical if you looked at them from the perspective of him saying this is what I've released. And I think it was only today, spin doctoring being what it is, when they suddenly said, oh, by the way, he consulted with this particular forum and therefore this is what informed it. But of course it shouldn't be a post event where he suddenly says, oh, now that you query what I did, look at who I spoke to. The process is supposed to be consultative from inception all the way up to regulation.
You wanted to come in, the president leaving the detail to the National Command Council and not tying himself up with the details.
Now, actually, the question for Khaya particularly, just to say that, Khaya, do you think that now that this has happened, do you think that this move by the president will see him regain some of the confidence that he enjoyed in the beginning of the lockdown?
Yeah, I think, of course, for a lot of people at the beginning of the lockdown, we all absolutely know what we're heading into. We didn't know what the duration of the lockdown would be, and we didn't know what the trajectory of the disease was going to be. So everybody had a lot of anxieties, and on that basis, we only had the central command, being the president himself, as our reference point. So I think us putting all of and him was informed by the simple fact that he absolutely knew no better. I think obviously now with the data that we've seen and the trends that we're witnessing, a lot more people are now going to be in a position to say, wait a minute, you've just said this, but we do not think that this is backed by what we've seen in our communities or the data that the command council itself has put out. So there's going to be a lot more feedback, but I don't think it necessarily represents a loss of faith. But I do suspect the past couple of weeks, that whole cigarette fiasco didn't help. And I think him now actually re-centralizing the conversation and putting out that it's still consultative at every step of the way will enable a lot more people to say, well, actually, we can contribute to the conversation. rather than it being seen as a dictatorship, which is quite arbitrary if you look at some of the regulations that have been put out there. So the consultation is really the buzzword that people should take going forward. And of course, in a consultation, it doesn't mean that my views or your views must prevail, but at least we should be able to say that we were heard, or at least we were listened to.